readily accessed at any time. If you have any questions or concerns about this, feel free to reach out to me and I will provide my contact information at the end. Also, it's important to know that the views expressed in this webinar do not represent the views, policies, or positions of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration or that of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. At the end of the webinar, there will be a survey. It's called SAMHSA's GIPRA. This just allows us to know how many people attended the webinar, your level of satisfaction. We really value your feedback and ask for your honest opinion on the webinar when it comes to you. Just a few things on how to interact with us during this webinar. Everyone is on mute only just so we prevent a lot of background noise from happening. We want to make sure everyone can hear, but we do encourage questions. So there are two ways that you can access that. On the bottom of your screen, there's a little ... You can click on that. It brings up Q&A, and you'll just type in your questions there. The other option you may see on your far right side, there is a little box that says Q&A. You can type in your questions there. We will make every attempt as possible to get to your questions. And we hope that if you do have questions, that we'll be able to answer those throughout the webinar. In terms of what to expect, we will start actually with a word from our director, Dr. Mark Wolfson, who will talk a little bit about setting the stage of why we felt this webinar was important and introducing our guest presenters for today. We will hear from Dr. DuPont, and after their presentation, Dr. Wolfson will also lead us in a discussion to ask some pertinent questions related to the topic of today's webinar. And then on the end, I'll provide announcements for upcoming webinars that we have, and we really hope that you all will join us for future webinars. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Wolfson so he can talk a little bit about why we felt this topic was important and also to introduce our presenters.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. So we're really excited and privileged to have the DuPonts with us on this first sort of substantive webinar of the Southeast Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And we're excited for a couple of different reasons. So one reason is, and you'll understand this better after I finish a brief introduction of both Drs. DuPont, but they've had a really historic role in our field of substance misuse, the science of substance misuse, the prevention and treatment of substance misuse. And so we're thrilled that they could be with us for this webinar. The second reason we're excited about it is that they've come up with what we think is a very important perspective to share with the field. And you'll hear quite a bit about it. The shorthand for it is one choice, but we think this is an important message for our audience. And our audience is people working in the field of prevention, substance misuse prevention. So we think that this is an important perspective. It's based in science, and we think that it has quite a bit of resonance when it's been shared across the country. So I have to give a little bit of a shout out to our colleague in the Southeast PTTC, Carlton Hall, because Carlton is the individual who came up with this idea and connected us with the DuPonts, and is one of the engineers of this, or architects, I should say, of this webinar today. So thanks everybody for joining. I think we're very excited. We have, I think, close to 500 people from across the country who have signed up for this webinar. Let me give brief introductions of both Dr. Caroline and Dr. Robert DuPont. So Dr. Caroline DuPont is a physician and MD. She trained at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center and then at Johns Hopkins. And she's a psychiatrist. She's board certified in psychiatry and also addiction medicine. She's been a prolific publisher of research and she serves as the vice president of the Institute for Behavior and Health in Rockville, Maryland. Robert DuPont also is trained as a physician and a psychiatrist. He did his training at Harvard. He was the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and also the second White House drug chief, commonly known as the drug czar. So I'm sure during the Q&A, Bob may have interesting stories to share with us about those experiences. So he's not rested on his laurels one bit. He's been very active since then, moving the field forward as a researcher and a clinician. And Dr. DuPont serves as the president, the founder of the Institute for Behavior and Health in Rockville. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand it over to the DuPonts for the webinar today.
To Carlton Hall, who put us together. I'm very grateful to Carlton for doing that. He's a wonderful leader in prevention and a great friend. As you heard from Mark, we are a father and a daughter who are preventionists and both certified addiction psychiatrists. It also, Mark mentioned that we are both clinicians working with our own patients with addiction over long periods of time, and we both feel that we have learned a great deal about addiction from our patients. Caroline and I are going to share the presentation, and there will be lots of time for questions and answers. So let's go to the slides. The first one. We're going to focus on brain science and the particular vulnerability of the adolescent brain. That's an extremely important concept for understanding why prevention is so crucial to the drug epidemic. We're going to look at the drug trends and implications for prevention, and we've got some new ways of looking at that data. The data itself is often, the sources of it is familiar to you, but the way we're putting it together, I think is going to be new and very, very useful. And then we're going to come down, as Mark mentioned, to this one choice message for youth in prevention. Let's think a little bit about what makes a drug. What is a drug? A drug is a chemical that superstimulates brain reward. Think about what that means. That means that human beings have discovered a group of chemicals that essentially hijack the brain's basic reward system for behavior. And this vulnerability is in all mammals and many other animals. It is not just some people, it's all people. This is hardwired in. And I think when we think about prevention, we often underestimate the importance of that biology that is center to our field. Now, go ahead.
So I think most of you are probably familiar with this slide or a version of this slide. This is showing that brain development continues through the mid-20s. We often say it continues until about the age of 25. And what we have found is that this slide is really a cornerstone for us. And when we give presentations to a wide range of audiences, this slide tends to really attract people's attention. And that's both adolescents and adults who might be interested in prevention issues. So I did find it interesting. I had always assumed that the blue parts of the brain were fully developed. But in this slide, what you're only seeing the fully developed brain is the purple part. So it's only a very small part of the brain that they're showing in this final picture is really fully developed. And people really like that and can understand this. And people can understand that they want to protect that brain development. So during this period of rapid brain development, the brain can be vulnerable to harm in a variety of different ways. And we often think about that with like concussion protocols and things like that for sports, for example. But it's extremely vulnerable to substance use at this age. And so when I talk to kids about want to protect their brain. There basically isn't a single person who feels that their brain has too many brain cells or that's too smart. And so when we talk about this, a lot of times people are like, oh, I get that. I still have a growing brain, and they point to me, and you don't, which is absolutely true. I do not have a developing brain anymore. And so they feel like this gives them a leg up, which I agree with, in terms of protecting their brain. So anyway, I really wanted to call attention to this. Also, I think that this brain science really shows the respect that we're giving when we're talking about prevention. People don't like to be spoken down to. They like to know, well, what is the science? What are we actually talking about? And so this visual is really useful for that, even though it's something that we're all pretty familiar with at this point. So we wanted to talk about this importance of living drug-free. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, so I think everybody can agree that living drug-free, at least through the age of 21, is very important. We have this statistic that 9 out of 10 adults with substance use disorders began smoking, drinking, or using drugs before the age of 18. And this is something certainly clinically is really obvious. When I meet with people with substance use disorders, they often started well before the age of 18. And so prevention is key. And then this is paired, of course, with what we were just talking about the unique vulnerability of that developing brain to substance use. And so that's why we're really focusing on this age group.
There's a question about what are we preventing? What is the goal of prevention? And there are many different answers to that question. Some talk about individual drugs. They talk about alcohol or marijuana or opiates, this kind of thing. Can we go? Yeah, that's the one we want. That's important. Or we talk about particular settings. We can talk about the Truth Campaign, for example, which has done a fabulous job about smoking. Is very specific just to cigarettes. Kind of thing. Or you can think about the idea of drunk driving. That's an example of a prevention program that relates not to drinking, but to in what setting it occurs. And then you can think about binge drinking as a concern. Well, there's endless ways of thinking about it, but the question that I want everybody to think about is, what do you mean by a drug? What counts as a drug? Is alcohol a drug? Is nicotine a drug, or is it a cigarette? What are we talking about? And when you use the word drug-free, that's a very slippery concept. It means whatever people think it means. It's very difficult to get at exactly what we mean by drug-free. And then again, what are we preventing? Use? Are we preventing use or misuse or overdose or other consequences? And another question that's troubling is, what do we mean by youth? When we talk about prevention, what do we mean by youth prevention? And we're going to talk about all of those things with you. But the context for all this discussion is the general normalization of youth experimenting with drugs and alcohol. A rite of passage, it's a normal part of the adolescent development. That is the way the issue is generally presented to the public. And we want to ask you to think about this, about other health messages designed for the public in general, but specifically for youth. Think about this one. You should wear a seatbelt every time you get in a vehicle. Okay? That's a health message. It's clear. You understand that every time anybody gets in a vehicle, including youth, you wear a seatbelt. But we know that many people don't wear seatbelts. And we also have laws about that. But think about the concept of experimenting. What would you think about youth experimenting with not wearing a seatbelt? What would happen if youth experimented with not wearing a seatbelt? You don't have to think very long to know what would happen. They would decide, they would find, they wouldn't decide, they would find that they didn't need a seatbelt. And then they'd talk to their friends. And their friends would not be wearing, who didn't wear a seatbelt, would say, I didn't have any problem either. And would we then conclude, oh, well, that's youth experimenting? We think that would be a bad idea. Why is that a bad idea? And why doesn't that apply to drugs? We think it is a bad idea because the consequences of not wearing a seatbelt, although it's not everybody, are very severe and unpredictable. That's exactly the same thing that's true with drugs. And so we want you to think again about the normalization of drug use in adolescence specifically. And also point out to you that the use of all these drugs is illegal for youth. And that's for very good reasons. And we also ask you to think about the commercial aspects of this, particularly now when we got legalized marijuana and the power of money in the decision to use drugs. But what we're seeking is a clear, simple statement of the goal of prevention based on research and applicable across the board. This is the one choice message, and here's the language, and this language in the middle here is very important to everything we're saying. And it is different from what most people are saying now, that the health goal for youth is no use of any alcohol, any nicotine, any marijuana, or other drugs for reasons of health for youth under 21. And we're going to talk to you about it. I'm sure you're shaking in your boots right with that one, but we're going to talk about that and go through it. But I want to point out to you how absolutely clear it is in terms of definitions of what we mean by drugs and what we mean by youth.
So this is where I miss actually having face-to-face with people. But going on with this, why not be substance specific? I think the thing that we really want to show is that for youth, all substance use is related. So when we think about these things that we're just talking about, why are we listing off those particular drugs in that kind of longer phrase instead of just saying drug-free? We're saying no use of any alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs. And we're going to show you why. So this is the first of 3 slides that I'm going to show you. And I know you probably see a lot of graphs, and a lot of them are great, but I'm telling you, these 3 graphs are really fantastic. They are so valuable, and they're so easy to understand, and they take that no-use language from being something that adults might just say to a teen, to something that they can really understand and that really is based in science and in data. So this particular slide, I'm going to walk us through it for a minute. It's past month use of drugs if marijuana is used by ages 12 to 17. So it's the past month, ages 12 to 17. Over on the left-hand side, you see where it says on the bottom, marijuana use no. So these are 12 to 17-year-olds who've all said, no, in the past month, I have not used any marijuana. And in that group, you can see all those bars are quite small. So the red is alcohol use. So only 8% of them used any alcohol in the past month, and a smaller number for binge alcohol use and heavy alcohol use. And the purple is cigarette use, again, 2.7%. And other illicit drugs is 2.2%. So if they didn't use any marijuana, they're also very unlikely to have used anything else. But now those columns on the right side, where it says marijuana use yes, you see that those bars are much more robust. So that first one is alcohol use, so 44.6%. So we've gone from 8% to 44.6% have said, yes, I used marijuana, and in fact, yes, I used alcohol. And you can see that the binge drinking and the heavy alcohol use have correspondingly also increased. And then you can see the higher number in the purple line for cigarette use, that 23.6% of people said, yes, if I used marijuana, I also used cigarettes. And then the blue line, again, is for other use, going from 2.2 to 21%. These numbers are huge, and it's very easy to see visually. So you might think, okay, so using marijuana, the people who use marijuana use other things. But look how we can do this. Let's look at this slide. This is a very similar slide, but it's asking past month use of drugs if alcohol is used, again, in that age group of 12 to 17. So on the far left, we've got alcohol use, no. And if they did not use alcohol, they correspondingly mostly did not use marijuana, other illicit drugs, or cigarettes. See how small those numbers are, 3.5%, 2.2, and 2.5% used anything else. But as soon as they say yes, they used alcohol even once in the past month, those numbers jump up. So we go up to 20% for marijuana, 10% for other illicit drugs, and 9% for cigarettes. But one of the things that we know about teen adolescent alcohol use is rarely is it once I had one drink in the past month, or often you don't see that. You see much heavier drinking patterns. So binge alcohol use, remember, is defined as 5 or more drinks in one setting. And unfortunately, that's pretty common, especially when you get to later high school and early college age. You often see people who are drinking considerably more than 5 drinks in one setting. And you also will see that the heavy alcohol use, which is 5 or more times their binge drinking in a month. And so that's basically every weekend they're going out and drinking at least one day of the weekend. Unfortunately, pretty common. So look at those numbers, how fast they jumped up. So for alcohol, when it was alcohol, no, it was 3.5%. And with binge drinking, there we are up at 34.3%. And for marijuana, and for heavy alcohol use, 54% for using marijuana if they're also a heavy alcohol user. So this is, again, very compelling at how these are all related. So I'm going to do one more. You're not going to be surprised at which one this is. This one is if you use cigarettes. Now, I'm going to pause here, and people usually, especially the kids, question me about this, about cigarettes. Of course, now I usually would like to use the word nicotine because there are a lot of new delivery devices for nicotine. But this data is based on the question of cigarettes, so we are sticking with the cigarettes. So if they said, nope, I didn't use any cigarettes in the past month, you can see, once again, I won't go through the numbers so much, but yes, they probably are unlikely to have done the other things. And if they did use smoke cigarettes, then those numbers, again, are very high. And this is why we think about these drugs as being very interrelated. And it isn't really different choices people are making. It's really one choice. And hence our name is what we're calling this, is one choice. People are making one choice, either to use or not to use. And once they've made that choice to use, the number of questions they have, how much, when, with which people, with which delivery device, all those questions become open to this person. But if they make that choice not to use, that one choice not to use one thing, then they're making the choice not to use the others. And that is really important. And this data, again, I get people poring over this data, and so I'm hoping that you also find this extremely useful.
Dr. DuPont, can I just pause for a quick moment? I actually had a question come up asking about, for those slides you were saying, the number of adolescents who are part of that survey that you all did.
This is the household survey that we're all familiar with.
Okay.
It's the national data, and I don't know what the number is, like 40,000.
Yes.
Okay, great. That's awesome.
This is the way the country keeps track of drug use. This is the data.
Mm-hmm.
This data is from SAMHSA, and it is the way the country keeps it. We didn't go out and get these numbers. We put it together in a way nobody's ever seen it before. But the data itself is from the National Household Survey.
Okay, great. Thank you. Someone had asked that from the chat. Thank you.
That was perfect. Yeah, that was perfect, because I think that is really key. This is not new data. It's a new demonstration of the data that we've had all along.
And again, to pick up on what Caroline said about the 3 drugs, those are the gateway drugs for youth. They're the 3 drugs that go together, that dominate the drug use picture for kids. And let me just go over them again. It's alcohol, nicotine, and they use cigarettes for the household survey, but that's there, and marijuana. Those are the dominant drugs that young people use. Okay, now we're going to go with this. Everybody's now thinking, okay, that's maybe a good idea, but it's unrealistic. So now we're going to switch over to a different data set, how to keep track of young people, and that's monitoring the future. This is the University of Michigan study that is done every year in high schools all over the country. This is nationally representative of U.S. high school students. And I have a particular affection for this study because when I was the White House drug czar, I got Lloyd Johnston to start this study. So I have a particular feeling about the fact that this is how the country keeps track of youth drug use with this Monitoring the Future study. It's a fabulous study. But the data you're looking at here was put together by IBH with the help of Lloyd Johnston, and it was never seen before. Nobody's ever done this before we did it. We didn't look at what's happening with marijuana or cigarettes or other drugs. We looked at a different question from the same data. And the question was, what percentage of high school seniors from 1976 to 2014 had not used any drug, any alcohol, any cigarettes, any marijuana, or any other drug in their lifetimes? That's the blue line. And you'll notice the low point was 1982 when it was 3%. It really was pretty much universal that everybody was using drugs in their lifetime. And then you look at what it is now, and the most recent data, 2014, is 26%. Think of that growth. Look at that curve. This is national data from the Monitoring the Future data. A little more than a quarter of high school seniors have never in their lifetime used any alcohol, any cigarettes, any marijuana, or any other drug. And that's up from 3%. Now look at the orange line. That's the same question, but now in the past month. In the past month, have you used any alcohol, any nicotine, any marijuana in the past month? And you'll see that low point was 16% at the same time. And it's now 52%. Half of high school seniors have not used any substance in the prior month. And look at the steadiness of those lines, those growth. That was not because of some particular policy or some program. That was the change of youth. And our point in this data today is that this idea of no use comes from the youth behavior itself. And you'll see that growth going on over that period of time in a very steady and very impressive way. Okay, now, for those of you who are interested in looking at the issue of 10th and 8th graders, so we got 8th, 10th, and 12th graders now. That didn't start until 1990. Before that, all we had was high school seniors. And if you look at the one on the left, that's the lifetime rate. And you'll see that about 60% of 8th graders have never used any drug in their lifetime. So 60%, roughly. And if you go down to 10th graders, it's 40%. And if you go to seniors, it's 26%. That's the effect of age on initiation of drug use. And you see the same trend lines and same relationships, but different numbers if you talk about the past month. And that's this study, where it starts out at about 82, goes down to 62, and then about 52%. This high school data is really important to understand about the question of whether the goal of no use is realistic. The answer is increasing, and a large percentage of American youth are already making that choice.
So I wanted to just break and mention about this, about who can make one choice, because I think one of the things that's really important about the data that we've just shown you is that differentiation between the lifetime no use and the past month no use. And what we're seeing is that there are a lot of people who it is lifetime no use, and that's fantastic, and we're extremely excited about that and about those people who are making that one choice not to use. But it is not something that you have to have never used in order to participate in one choice. So one of the things I want to think about again is seatbelts. So if someone tells you, yeah, I don't usually wear my seatbelt, but but you give them the data and they decide to start wearing their seatbelt every day, that's awesome. We don't say you're excluded now from wearing your seatbelt every day. We say that's great. That's wonderful. Wear your seatbelt every day. So everybody can be included in this prevention message for health. So that can be teens who've never used, teens who've used in the past, and even individuals who've had significant substance use problems who are now making this one choice in early recovery, early or long-term recovery. This message is a health message that is consistent in any of these groups.
Okay, now we're going to look at a series of the three slides from the Monitoring the Future data about what's happened to drug use in the United States overall with respect to particular drugs. And these numbers are absolutely fascinating. Just spend your time for a moment here looking just at alcohol. This is the percentage of youth of high school seniors, not of youth, high school seniors, who have used alcohol in the past month. And you'll see it peaked around 1980 when the number was a little more than 70%. Look at what that number is now. It's down to just over 30%. That is a remarkable line, and I don't think many of you have seen that line before. That shows a steady decrease, or a steady decrease in the percentage of American youth who have used alcohol in the past month. Now I want you to look at another line to look at it and see how different it is. Look at the marijuana line. That's the green line. And you'll see it peaked at the same time. They all peaked about the same time. But look at what happened. It fell off like a cliff, down from something like 38% down to 11% in the course of the time between 1979 and 1992. That was a dramatic 62% drop in marijuana use among American youth in the United States. People talk about prevention is hopeless. Look at that number. But then you see the inflection, and it started up again, and it's gotten up to 22, 23%, and more or less it's been steady since about 1996. We're going to talk some more about how that happened in this next slide. What happened during that time when it was coming down was what's called the parents' movement from 1978 to 1992. And there was for people who weren't around at that time, it's hard to imagine that there was a general sense about marijuana as a drug that was a bad idea for kids to use. And that went across a broad spectrum of politics and attitudes in the United States at that time. Now look at the next slide. Something changed, and what changed was the marijuana legalization movement. That started in 1992. 1996 was the first state that legalized medical marijuana. And you see how the marijuana line has changed, not going back to where it was. It's not nearly where it was in 1978. At that period of time, I was the director of NIDA at that point, and 1 in 9, 11% of high school seniors then were smoking marijuana every day. 1 in 9 every single day. The current number for that is about 6%. So it's way down from what it was like at that time. Of course, the marijuana is different now. But anyway, the point is, you see that line and how it's different. Now look at the cigarette line. It was fairly steady until about 1997, and then the bottom fell out. It went from 35% down to under 10%. And notice that in 2008, cigarettes, marijuana passed cigarettes. And if you look at the line, the green line and the red line, you can see that marijuana is on a path within a few years to go past alcohol. That's very striking to see these lines and think about what this is. This is the data, again, from the National from the Monitoring the Future study, the way the country looks at drug use for youth.
So this is just a close-up of the end of that graph where you're seeing the cigarette line, which is now the white line, falling this slide is good news because obviously the cigarette line has fallen so much. It's not very good news that marijuana line has not fallen, and as we saw from the previous slide, it had come back up to get to the place that it is now. But we really want to call attention to that because there are some things going on that are worrisome in terms of the direction this is going. So these are things that we're considering threats to the progress that we've made. So we're super optimistic and happy about those data we just showed you. But there are things that are changing here. And what we've got is commercial for profit marijuana industry, which is really a game changer, I think all of us know. We also have vaping, which is another huge change in terms of that nicotine delivery, and that I think is going to change things for all of us. And then we have the overdose epidemic, and as we know, it's hard to open a newspaper without having that right in your face. So we're going to go through these topics for a minute.
I think we're pretty used to the idea that the tobacco industry promoted smoking cigarettes and that had phenomenal health consequences for our country. I don't think we thought nearly enough about what a commercialized, for-profit marijuana industry means for youth and for the country as a whole. But we're focused here just on youth. And what the implications of that are very profound, and it's amazing to me how little attention is being paid to it.
So this slide is just showing about the kind of big marijuana is using big tobacco playbook. So we often are used to that term of big tobacco, but I feel like we're only beginning to understand that now we've got big marijuana. So we had just talked about the exciting progress that's been made with the Truth Campaign, which had to do with the big tobacco settlement and all that money that then went into campaigning against use of tobacco. And now we have big marijuana that is really playing the same game, and it's not subtle. So that's why we put this slide up just to show how they used to market cigarettes as with doctors and looking like it had some health benefit to it. And now, of course, marijuana is often going with that health and that mixing up that question of is it recreation or is it medicine? So then I wanted to show just a few slides. I've got about 1 billion of these on my phone at this point. Every time I see any of these things, I stop and take pictures. And I wonder if you guys are all doing that too. It's almost unbearable for me to see how this has changed in my lifetime. But again, we have this confusion. So this one on the top, I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to call it Corova, unrivaled potency. And then it has this thing that says medicate responsibly, which I think so much is that language that we use for something like alcohol or that sort of thing. But it has that medicate suggestion in there as if this is a medicine, but then we're doing unrivaled potency. And I don't know what we think that picture is of the three-eyed cow or whatever that is, but that's not looking like a medicine to me. This is what is confusing, I think, to everybody. So I would say it's confusing to youth, to adolescents, but frankly, it's confusing to adults. So we've got delivering more joy than dogs and babies combined, marijuana delivered. And then the smaller picture is a little scary kind of thing that's going on, has to do with the edible market. You know, again, we're talking a little bit about different delivery methods, and we'll talk about that some more. But it's really a game changer when you really start changing delivery methods of things. And so what we're seeing here is that you can have little taste tries, like I would be familiar with it, something like at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, where you could try things. And here we're taste trying things that have marijuana or other cannabis products in them. And as you know, many of the things now are much more potent. They're distilled down, and so much stronger than anything people kind of are thinking about. You know, it's not your. People say sometimes it's not your grandfather's marijuana. That is for sure. So I had somebody mention from that picture that they had seen something like this, and they almost gave it to their child because they thought it was just a tasty-fry at a store, and they didn't realize what it was. And so that, of course, gets all of our attention. And then we just threw this in just to, if you're not in a state that already has legalized marijuana, you may not realize this kind of number. So this is a map that's just showing how easy it would be for you to find a marijuana dispensary near yourself in downtown Denver or Los Angeles. And we've seen research that showed in areas like this, there are more marijuana dispensaries, both medical and recreational, than there are McDonald's and Starbucks combined. And if that isn't a sign of the commercialized recreational pharmacology, I don't know what it is.
Okay, we're going to take a little pause here, have you look at this with me for a moment. This is about vaping. Vaping started out to do with nicotine. Juul has gotten themselves in the crosshairs, and it's very interesting as there's been a cutback on Juul and they've taken out the flavorings from it. Their competitors are eating them alive by continuing to do that. And you'll notice that it isn't just nicotine, but it's also marijuana. So look at the 8th graders, and you can see the comparison of the vaping of marijuana and vaping of nicotine. And you'll notice the growth on the 10th and 12th graders, and it is a very common thing, and it is increasing very rapidly. And the potential for the future is not just these two drugs, but all drugs. And I want to step back with you a little bit about the history of drugs in the world and think with you about how route of administration is so important in terms of the public health consequences of drug use. The Native Americans didn't have any health problems with tobacco. In fact, nobody in the world had much health problem with tobacco until the invention of the cigarette. The cigarette changed everything. That is what caused the problem because of that delivery system was so much more efficient. It changed it. The same thing happened with intravenous, sub-Q, and then intravenous drug use. The use of the needle to inject drugs changed everything. And you saw the same thing happen in the 80s with cocaine, with crack. Cocaine, people now don't remember, that they don't know that in the early years of the drug epidemic, cocaine was thought of as being like marijuana. It was harmless. One of my predecessors, or a person in the White House drug office, famously said in this era that there's more danger in downhill skiing than using cocaine. Well, after Len Biles, nobody said that anymore, and that had to do with the emergence of crack. But again, I think we underestimate the power of the route of administration and just how profound the change is with vaping. Now, Caroline talked a little bit about some of the sort of the big picture of this. It's stunning to me that drug overdose is now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 50 and younger. Think about that. Talk about something that how important that is for us. So that's really remarkable. But then I wanted to talk to you about something else. There's a lot of things in the news right now about opioids and about how the problem is opioid overdoses. And I want to point out to you something, that the problem isn't opioid overdoses, it's drug overdoses. 95% of the people dying of opioids have other drugs in their body at death, drugs of abuse, at death, and as much as 11 other drugs. The drug problem is a poly-drug problem, just like we saw with the young people. The overdose death problem is a poly-drug problem. It is not substance specific. That's really important to understand that. And here's the third point. In the last 3 years, the life expectancy in America has gone down for the first time since the flu epidemic in 1918. That's a consequence of the drug use in our country. It is a massive public health problem. Now, this is going to take a minute to think about this word, commercialized recreational pharmacology. That's the way we think about what the drug problem is. It's commercialized, and by commercialized, I don't mean just legally commercialized, but commercialized illegally also, because the illegal suppliers are commercially exploiting drug use and promoting it, just the way the legal people do, except the legal people do it a lot more efficiently than the illegal. But both are commercialized. Recreational, that is using drugs, self-controlling it for your pleasure. And that is a very dangerous threat. And it used to be it was a few drugs. Now it's thousands of different drugs. And it used to be mostly agricultural, like cocaine is agricultural, marijuana is agricultural, heroin is agricultural. But the newer drugs are synthetic, fentanyl being an example of this, and they can be made anywhere. The agricultural drugs, you had to have a field full of it. Not now. It can be made in a laboratory that's mobile and can be anywhere. These things super stimulate brain reward. This is biology, and it's not anybody particular, it's everybody. They have a very powerful effect. And the for-profit industry is driving this now in a very dramatic way. And what drives the drug field is the money that's spent on it, and that is spent by the drug users.
So we want to think about what are the action steps? What are the things that prevention leaders can do? And so you guys are the experts on prevention. And what we're asking is you to look at this data and hopefully be excited about it the way we are. So we're looking at embracing this one-choice prevention message, which is no use of any alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs for reasons of health. So we're setting a new health standard, which is a clear health standard. So again, like seatbelts, we don't say wear your seatbelt if it's dark, or wear your seatbelt if you're in the front seat, or wear your seatbelt if you're on the highway. It's always wear your seatbelt, even though we know that some people don't wear their seatbelt. And so this clear message, we do spell out the different drugs the way Bob mentioned, because if you just say drug-free without defining drug-free, you'll allow people to make their own judgments about what is a drug. And I'm sure you've run into this. People think alcohol, is that a drug? Marijuana, is that a drug? Cigarettes, is that a drug? And so we want to be clear about all of these are substances that fall into this category from a health perspective. So we want you to know that we're not talking about a new a new prevention program. We're talking about a message that can be integrated into any existing prevention program, and hopefully providing data that's useful for you in supporting that prevention message. We think it's so important to support the prevention message with actual science and with the data, with the science of the developing brain, with the data that's showing that all drug use is related, with the data that's showing that all drug use, that teen drug use is not inevitable, with showing the data that it is possible for people to be, to grow up drug-free, which is obviously our goal. And we also want to have this be something that is really being used to help promote teen self-care and autonomy. We want teens to be able to see, oh, this makes sense for me. I want to protect my brain health. And I have goals and dreams for my future, and I don't want to do anything that's going to damage that brain development. Again, that's a really strong selling point with this. We see this as a great opportunity for teen leadership. What we have found is that what I call the 26%, the people who haven't used at all, or you could call them the 52%, the people who have used maybe occasionally in the past, but now have made the decision to stop. These people often fly under the radar. They don't post on Instagram, another great drug-free weekend. But they do post what they're doing, all the ways that they're involved and immersed in busy, productive, ambitious lives. And so we think that this is a great opportunity for teen leadership. So we wanted to share with you one organization that is already doing this. So this is an organization in Rye, New York, and they, it's called hijacked Coalition. They are a wonderful organization, and they had a robust prevention program before getting to know our one-choice messaging. In fact, they got to know our one-choice messaging before we had a one-choice message, before we had come up with that term. And they've integrated it into all the different areas of their prevention message. And I just picked this one picture that I liked, which you can see these are little Post-its that they've done. They're very colorful, that says, I am one. I choose to be drug-free because, and they're talking about what it is that they're doing with their life and what it is that's important to them about their life. And really claiming that identity as being I am one. Or sometimes I'll say, I'm a one-choice kid. That's a kind of an identity for some people that they enjoy. They've integrated it into these great organization things that they've done at Parent University on Prevention to work with the parents, a youth speak out event where the youth are sharing their information with younger kids, and having a healthy teen brain day where they have a community event where people can come and learn about prevention and about one choice. So anyway, this is just an example kind of showing how an organization that was already had a great program has been able to use some of these this data and this language.
The one choice is a message, not a program. It doesn't compete with any other prevention program. It supports all other prevention programs. I think that's very important. We've emphasized that. I want to emphasize that again here at the end, that this comes from the behavior the kids, youth in America are already demonstrating. And what we want in particular moving forward is to have the voice of the people who've made this choice heard in the youth population. Right now, it is not. And I think it's really important to see the leadership of the youth, to respect that trend, and to build it. Now, there's a real problem in thinking about the absolutism in the one choice. None at all. We have been working with the American Academy of Pediatrics about what pediatricians say to youth about drugs. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out with a very clear statement that the goal for youth is not to use at all. That's wonderful. But when we go to individual pediatricians, it's a really hard sell. It's hard for them to say those words. And we think it's going to be hard for you to say those words. And we want to point out to you that we can have a goal without having everybody do it. And a very simple one of the pediatrics we use with them is every pediatrician in the country says, don't drink sugary sodas. Every pediatrician in the country says, exercise every day. They know darn well kids drink sugary sodas. They know darn well they're kids who don't exercise. Do they disrespect those people? I don't think so. But they have a standard for health. And that's what we're talking about. Being able to say in words, simple, direct words, this is the standard. Drug prevention is brain protection. The youth brain is particularly vulnerable. Youth using drugs is it has a risk that goes on throughout the life cycle, not just in youth, because of that vulnerability of that brain. So it's not saying that we think nobody is going to use drugs anymore. Just like we don't think everybody's going to wear seatbelts all the time or stop drinking sugary sodas. But by golly, we can have a standard and we can articulate it in an unembarrassed way to get that idea across. So to me, what we're after slaying, and we want to slay, is the normalization of youth experimenting with drugs. We want to say that's not healthy, and it's dangerous to have that as your standard. So we want to encourage you to think about this, look at this data, and we hope you'll be interested in joining with us and lots of other people who have come on board in this idea. Thank you very much. You are leaders in prevention. I want to thank Nicole and Mark for the wonderful opportunity we had to do this. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. We're looking forward to the Q&A that comes up. Next slide. A couple more here. This is a book that I wrote. I just very recently published called Chemical Slavery, and it essentially lays out what addiction is chemical slavery, paid for by the slaves. And I think you'll find some very interesting things there, including a very long section about prevention, but also about treatment and a global perspective on what's going on with our drug epidemic. I'm very proud that the forward of the book is from Barry McCaffrey, who was Bill Clinton's drug czar and a wonderful guy. You'll see here also that IBH is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have no stake in any commercial interest in any of this. I invite you to go take a look at ibhinc.org. That's our basic website, and also especially onechoiceprevention.org. And an area that we're very interested in also is drug driving. Stop Drug Driving is another website we have that I invite you to take a look at.
And for those of you that were interested in specifically the references for our slides, we encourage you to look at any of these references and resources that we have here. And of course, you can get in touch with us through those websites. We are excited to share our data. So we're not at all proprietary about it. We want you to use it.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for a comprehensive and whirlwind tour of the field and this idea, this concept of one choice. So this is great. We have quite a bit of time for Q&A. And so what I'd like to actually do is spend a couple of minutes trying to summarize what we see as the key points in your argument. And you can correct me or push back. And then I'll start with some questions, and then we'll open it up with some questions from the audience. An overarching point that I think is worth making is that I think, although you may have your differences with the pediatricians, I think you've got a tremendous amount in common with prevention folks, with people working in the area of prevention. So while I think the data is being presented and some of the concepts are being presented in a different way, I think this will really resonate with our audience of prevention workers in the 8 states that we serve and beyond. Okay, so a little bit of a summary. So what I took away is the key arguments. So, it's important to start in biology, particularly brain science, and think about the vulnerability of the developing brain. And then the second point, I think, is a really important one, but I think one that prevention folks will agree with, that substance abuse disorder and problems start in youth. You had some very compelling data about how 90% of the time among people with substance use disorder, their use started before the age of 18. So it's very important to focus on youth, and I think the field is, you'll get very little, if any, argument from prevention folks about that. I think the point about normalization of youth drug use is a really critical point, and I think that is something that people may not have thought about in those terms before. This idea that it's become normalized, normative for youth to experiment with drugs. And by drugs, we're talking about alcohol, tobacco, prescription drug misuse, and illicit drugs. I thought the example with seatbelts was very powerful, this idea that, we really would not advocate experimentation with seatbelts. That's a very clear message that's out there. So that presents something of a model for how we can try to denormalize the behavior in a kind of a universal or categorical way. So that, I think, leads to this idea of trying to come up with a clear and simple statement that can kind of put aside the vagaries of, what is a drug? Do we need to focus on a particular drug? And are we talking about no drug use, no experimentation at all, no heavy use? And so this challenge of coming up with a clear and simple statement that's research-based and can be used universally, I think is the right goal. And so what you've come up with, and it'll be interesting to hear from our audience how it resonates with them, but this message, this idea of one choice. You can choose to use drugs or preferably choose not to use drugs. I think the argument about trying to avoid substance-specific prevention was a really important argument that will be of interest to our consumers, the folks working in prevention in the field. This idea of all drug use, youth drug use being related, and the monitoring the National Household Survey data that you showed on that, I think, is a very effective tool for making that point. So we're pleased that we'll be able to share your slides. I think the question about is it realistic is a question that I had when we started our conversations, and the fact that this is a very powerful secular trend, that we're seeing more and more people, more and more youth who are not engaging in any drug use. What a powerful argument that is, because if we have a slogan, a motto, a concept, a message, if you will, that goes against the grain of what we actually see happening, that's really tough, and that makes one wonder whether it's realistic. But so I think being able to show that data, showing how over time there's been dramatic change in the number of youth who are choosing not to use any drugs. So let me not belabor it. Let's go into some Q&A, especially about how folks working in the field of prevention can use the message. But let's start actually with the idea of pushback. So you talked a little bit about the pushback that you've received, maybe not from the organized field of pediatrics, but from individual pediatricians. So can you talk a little bit about the pushback that you've received and how people might overcome it? So if some of the listeners, some of the participants in the webinar are working with pediatricians in their community, how can this idea be sold to them?
Caroline's the queen of pushback. Take it away.
Well, I was pretty surprised by how aggressive the pushback I got was. So that's, I guess, what gave me that title. What we found with the pediatricians is that they're very concerned that having a strong statement is going to alienate them from their patients. And that if they say to their patients, don't use, that then their patients are not going to tell them if they are using. And I think this is why some of the examples we've used, for example, the seatbelts or the sugary drinks or bicycle helmets are so important because we're not really afraid to say those things, even though we know that not everybody is going to follow that advice. That has been a very helpful way for me to explain to pediatricians how this is similar to other health messages, as opposed to what they're concerned is coming across as being very paternalistic or bossy or dogmatic, which they know turns their patients off. And so again, it's also backing it up with the science is really key. So rather than it being just a sentence, it's really important to back it up. And right, they're ready to do that with things like bike helmets. I like to use bike helmets as an example, and we didn't really do that very much, because I think that's another area where there's an interesting change. When I was a child, nobody wore bike helmets, or very few people wore bike helmets. It wasn't really even a thing. And it got to the point that everybody wears bike helmets. You know, if I'm out on the bike trail, it's unusual for me to see people now without bike helmets. It's completely changed in terms of what I'm seeing is actually happening in the community. But in the past year or so, I've noticed a radical change, and that is with those bike sharing and also the scooters that you can rent that are scattered all over the cities. Those don't come with helmets. And so all of a sudden, these people who would never go out on their weekend bike ride without their helmet are zipping through the city streets without their helmet. And I think it's really interesting just to think about how these things always are evolving, and you need to be able to be flexible, but you need to also be able to present the data. And the data is you should wear your bike helmet every time, and even if you're renting a bike or a scooter, you ought to get your helmet on. Well, this is the same thing with substance use. It's okay to have a strong line, even if you know that some of your patients are not going to follow that. The other thing I wanted to say is one of the things about the pediatricians is they are adults, and if you look at that that line of how it's changed over time, and so again, I can talk about the 26% now that haven't used any alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs as high school seniors. Back in the 80s, that was the 3 to 5% range. A lot of our pediatricians were teenagers during that era or shortly after that era, and so they have a worldview that isn't actually the way it is now. And so I think giving them that data and showing them how things have changed can be really powerful.
Mark, let me mention one more thing about this that I think is really important. We're talking about kids. We're talking about youth. We're not talking about everybody. We're not going back to alcohol prohibition. We're not talking about putting people in jail for smoking cigarettes. We're just talking about kids. And that is really important, because once we start talking about adults, we get all kinds of pushback that is very difficult to deal with. But with kids, the marijuana industry officially says they don't want kids smoking. Juul doesn't want them vaping. The tobacco industry doesn't want them. They want to raise the tobacco age to 21. So we can fight about adults' drug use, but I don't think there's a fight about kids' use. I don't think there's any argument that it's a good thing for kids to use drugs.
Thank you. So thinking about our audience of people working at the state level or the community level on prevention. I think this, and hopefully we'll hear from them soon. We'll turn to Q&A from the audience. But I think this message is not a hard sell, as I said earlier, to people working in prevention, because abstinence, no drug use is the message. That's the message that we typically use in prevention. So I don't think this will be a hard sell. What I think is exciting about what you're bringing forward for our field of prevention is some of the very strong arguments that I think you can make based on data that this is realistic, that we shouldn't focus on individual drugs, but focus on all drug use. So I'm wondering, what would your advice to people working in the field of prevention be? Are there, in terms of presenting data or in terms of presenting the message, what do you think are the most compelling pieces of your argument that people working in prevention can use in their work?
Well, we've kind of given you our best things. I think the one that really is a clincher, though, is to get the kids, the one-choice kids, to talk about it. Why didn't they use drugs? How is it working out for them? How's their social life? How's their academic life? How does this fit into family things? I think to give them voice is really very, very important.
Great. And are there any trials of this going on? Are there any scientific studies looking at the effectiveness of this message? Because sometimes the message can sound great to us, to researchers, to policymakers, but until we really test it in the field, we don't know how it works. So
we're inviting our audience to do that. Go for it. I'm very interested in that. I think that's a very wonderful thing, and that's what we want. We don't have any examples of that, except what we do when we give our talks to people, including, as Caroline says, talking to kids. It's very interesting how receptive kids are to this message.
Mm. Great. Well, let me check with Nicole. I certainly have more questions, but I want to open it up to our audience if the Q&A is working.
Sure, yeah. So we had a couple questions that I think are pretty relevant. One, there are folks who are interested in this one choice concept, and someone actually asked, is the one choice a copyright term, and do we need permission before using it?
We want you all to use it.
So it is a copyright term. We want you all to use it. We would like you to credit us with and link to our websites, and we would be happy to link to your website.
Okay.
But just use it. We want you to use it.
Use it. The answer is use it.
The answer is use it. Okay. But give credit, right? When we talk about prevention ethics, a part of that is giving credit where credit is due. There is another.
Not required. What's required is just use it.
It's just to use it, yes. So there is another question that I think is somewhat relevant. You know, it says, today the Just Say No message is from the Reagan era, where it derided as ineffective for teens. And so how is the one choice to avoid all substances different from the Just Say No era?
So I'd like to just say that you made Bob's day by asking that question. Thank you.
When Ronald Reagan was elected president, and Nancy Reagan came into the White House, one of the first people she talked to was me. I had a meeting with Nancy Reagan before there was Just Say No.
Okay.
And talked to her about that. The parents' movement started 3 years before Nancy Reagan came to the White House. So this movement was not Nancy Reagan's. She jumped on the wagon that was already going with this. And people who say the Just Say No didn't work have never looked at the youth drug use data in this country. We had a 62% fall in youth drug use between 1978 and 1992. That's a massive change of behavior. And to say Just Say No didn't work is wrong. But it wasn't really Just Say No. It was a much bigger than that. And the sad story is, to the extent that it got associated with Nancy Reagan, when she left, the support went away or went down. And that also happened at the same time that the marijuana legalization started. But I think to say that one choice didn't work is not right. It worked phenomenally.
Nicole, could you turn your yes, great.
You're welcome. I realized mine wasn't on. Sorry about that. So another interesting question that came was actually when you all were mentioning the Truth campaign for tobacco being very effective in reducing those numbers, and just wondering how that model that they use could potentially be applied to the one choice idea as a way of empowering youth to, in the same way that the Truth campaign did. And so just your thoughts about that. Are there ways that the Truth campaign could be utilized, that concept, to be added to the one choice model?
So I think this is a great point. What I would like to say is what they have, a really important thing that we don't have, and that is they have all that tobacco settlement money. They have all that money. And so our speaking to you, this organization, and all of you people who are out there in the trenches doing this work, is our attempt to be the Truth campaign. We're saying, yes, we can do it, but we're just us, and we need you.
So I'd like to suggest an answer to that and see what the doctors DuPont think about it. So one of the compelling things about the Truth campaign that distinguished it from many previous campaigns, actually it built on models of earlier state campaigns, beside it being very well resourced, obviously, was it took the industry on. And it talked about how the industry was interfering with your ability to make your choice.
Yes.
So that might be an area where, you could think about blending, some of what we learned from the Truth Campaign and this one choice model.
Wow, is that true, Mark? You're absolutely right. But look at what Sam, Smart Alternatives to Marijuana, Kevin Sabet is doing. He's exactly taking that playbook and applying it to marijuana. And the marijuana industry makes his job very easy because they're so outrageous in the claims that they are making. And so it fits very well. The issue that the Truth Campaign's problem is vaping. And they focused on cigarettes. They didn't focus on nicotine. That was a big mistake. Yeah. But that's what they did. And so they're trapped in their own language. But Juul is presented as a safer way to use nicotine to get people off of smoking. So they didn't go after it and say, now when they do the ads, you'll see that they say Juul is only for people who are smokers. That's right. That's their intention. But that's not what's happening with it out there. And the other thing is cigarettes have had a clear shot since 1964. That's when the beginning of the attitudes about knowledge about health effects. And it's so stunning, the consequences with cigarettes are clear. Look at marijuana, what's going on in terms of trying to encourage people not to use marijuana. Anything that's said about a health problem with marijuana is disputed. Anything is. And that was true for tobacco until 1964. But you see that with the other drugs. It's difficult. The cigarettes was what's say the low-hanging fruit. In terms of this, but the basic ideas they're using are absolutely right. And I would say this about all drug supply, including illegal drug supplies, is exploitative of kids and everybody else too. So I like that message, but it isn't just the legal; it's the illegal distributors also are exploiting it.
Thank you, Nicole. We have an important message, I think, from Janet Rouse. Do you want to share that?
Yes, I'm seeing that now. Yeah. So she's saying that Safe Launch is actually already using and sharing the One Choice message, and just letting everyone know that, we should follow you guys on Facebook, share it on social media, and then recognizing using social media platforms. So, for instance, she mentions Instagram and the hashtag One Choice. So we think about how we can all contribute to this message. And you mentioned earlier showing the kids who are not doing, hashtag One Choice, and that, our youth and this message there on platforms like Instagram and those sorts of things. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to get involved with helping push that message.
So that is fantastic. Thank you so much for that message. We really appreciate that. The one thing I'll just say to remember, so One Choice is a great little line. I love hashtag One Choice, please. But it needs to be followed by what that means. And what that means is no use of alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, or no use of alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs by people under the age of 21 for reasons of health. And at some point, you have to actually get that message in there, because otherwise, what in the world does One Choice mean?
Right, absolutely. There is, I guess maybe we have time for maybe one more question before we should probably start closing up here. Looks like Jenna Stein asked about your thoughts about folks who drink at religious events. Does One Choice still apply no matter the event that's occurring?
Well, you're talking about people under 21 going to... right. We think that's great. Go right ahead. That doesn't count.
You mean like communion at church and that kind of thing?
Communion at church, yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole different thing.
It's not clarified, but that's where I'm assuming. Yeah.
The only people who can have a problem with the communion wine are the priests. The parishioners are not going to have a problem.
Okay, but I think I would like to expound on that a little bit, because sometimes people say things like, if you're drinking with your family, that that's a responsible way to teach your children how to drink. And so there might be a slippery slope in there where it could be a little bit expanded. And I think you do need to be aware that there is really no safe level of use. So a sip of something is no problem, and I guess I would go with that. Like, I'm very clear, this is not like a purity pledge we're asking people to take, and that's really important. There is not a line in the sand here. Once you've crossed that, you don't count. You know, we're not saying that at all. But there isn't a safe level, and so it should be considered when you're actually asking what you're actually talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
As we're coming to an end, I want to just thank you for this opportunity, Nicole and Mark. This is a milestone. This event today is a milestone in the story of One Choice, and we are very, very grateful for this opportunity with your audience and the tremendous support you have given. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for what you've done. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And Nicole will be getting the slides out and making them available to folks, right? And
that is correct.
I'm at a pod in the airport, so I do want to recommend this book. It's very helpful. This is the DuPonts did not pay me to say this, but there's a chapter on prevention that I think folks working in our field will find very helpful. So let me, because I think they may cut me out of this space pod, as somebody called it, any moment now. Let me hand it over to Nicole for closing remarks.
Yes. Thank you. So let me just click over here really quickly. There we go. And just to end with a few announcements again, thank you so very much for the webinar today. This was really, really awesome. A lot of good things to think about in terms of what One Choice is and the way us as prevention field can kind of contribute to that message. So thank you very much. In our last 5 minutes, I wanted to just provide an opportunity to share with you all our upcoming webinar that we have in September. And to save the date for September 3rd from 3 to 4:30. And we've got Carlton Hall. He's actually on the call. Carlton, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. We can hear you.
Fantastic.
Hi, Carlton.
Hello, everybody. And again, allow me to add my thanks and gratitude as well to Caroline and Dr. Robert DuPont. Thank you both for a tremendous presentation that this was. I think it was an essential message to the field. Thank you, and God bless you for bringing it. Dr. DuPont, I read your book, of course, thoroughly, and there's a very interesting piece in it that I came across. It seems like there's a letter in it, and it was a letter about a young man who was going to Africa, and the letter is dated 1961, and this letter is about that young medical student who needed someone to vouch for him when he went out there on that trip. And the letter happened to be signed by none other than Dr. Martin Luther King for you. And I am very, very much interested in that backstory at some point in time. But I just want to say thank you for your service to our country. Absolutely, you have been a mentor.
That letter from Martin Luther King is one of the most treasured things in my life. He was a very important person in my life. He died, a part of me died.
Amen. 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 Well, I just want to give a sense of the breadth of your great service to our country. Thank you so much. And to your point, Nicole, we have a fabulous part 2 to this first webinar that we were able to deliver today, and the next one is going to be actually presented by none other than Amy Ronshausen, who is the Executive Director of Drug-Free America Foundation. That organization is a tremendous organization that is focused on prevention and policy. Many of our listeners already know them, but Amy is going to speak about prevention in the changing marijuana landscape. And all of this conversation that we have really sets us up for Amy to take us even deeper into this, where she's going to be able to provide an overview of the marijuana policy landscape and provide specific emphasis on some of the efforts that they were able to conduct in Florida to actually mitigate some of the negative consequences that other states who have been going through some very similar challenges have occurred. And so I highly encourage everyone to come back and join us for that particular webinar. And again, thank you both, Drs. Robert and Dr. Caroline DuPont. Thank you so much for doing this webinar. Nicole, back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. The last thing we will just say is how to contact us. Everyone who is on the webinar today, you will get the slides. They've been gracious enough to give us those slides, so I will be sending those out to everyone. Again, we are so happy to have provided this webinar to you all. Thank you again, Drs. DuPont, for this wonderful information. We hope that everyone will join us again in September as we start talking about marijuana and how this relates to our area and the work that we do. So I hope you all have a wonderful Friday. Thank you so much. It's Friday at 4:30. You guys are dedicated professionals to be on a webinar on a Friday at 4:30. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.